So recently I did a full review on the Z mount 2.0 teleconverter for the Nikon Z mirrorless cameras, and I was impressed with it, gave it very high marks. And I had a few comments. Some of them were very interesting with good suggestions or things that maybe I should have included. And a couple of those were good enough that made me want to go out and do a part two. So I've done that. So for starters, viewer Andrew Edgerton, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Andrew, suggested that he would have liked to have seen a side-by-side comparison with the 70 to 200 at 200 millimeters magnified to 200% versus that with the 70 to 200 with the teleconverter at 400 millimeters, right? That would be, in his words, the apples to apples comparison, and I don't disagree. I think that was legit, and when I read his comment, I said, oh yeah, good point. I really should do that. So I did do that comparison in a pretty controlled environment, but not a purely scientific environment. So I don't ever construe any of my testing to be considered scientific. I'm not a scientist. I don't wear a white lab coat, and I shoot in the field and in reality. I don't really do lab tests. But this was a pretty easy one to do, so I did. So let's take a look at the results of that. All right, so let's take a look, as Andrew suggested, at the comparison of 200% for the native lens without the teleconverter versus 100% with the teleconverter. That's what we see here on the screen, and this is at the maximum zoom. So 200 millimeter for the native lens and 400 millimeter for that with the teleconverter. All right, so starting on the right side over here, this is 100% at 400 millimeters with the 2x teleconverter, and that is the Z mount teleconverter, the new one. This photograph was taken with the Z9 also for whatever that might be worth. And let's see if I can line these up a little bit better. They don't line up perfectly. The first thing I noticed is that the 100% with the teleconverter just seems to be a little, I'm not going to say sharper, but it does seem to have a little more contrast, and it also does not have the chromatic aberration that we're starting to see here at 200% crop with the native lens. So that's actually very interesting. Now you can see that it's in there. I don't know if you're able to see that, if this is coming through on YouTube on the video, but in these bands right here, you can see that coloring. And so I know that if I magnified it, it's going to come out probably just as pronounced as it is here. So that's probably more a matter of magnification than anything, but you can definitely see that there. Still, that would be an artifact that you would be producing if you cropped in at 200%. So with the 200 millimeters at 200% crop, I'm looking at the number 400 here, and you can see it's not terribly sharp, but if you look over here with the teleconverter, it looks much sharper. So in my opinion, your opinion may differ, but hopefully you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing. To my eye, I have a better image with the teleconverter at 400 millimeter than I do without the teleconverter at 200 and then cropping in to 200%. I mean, to me, it's very obvious, very apparent. It's just a better image with the teleconverter. Now, obviously, if you go to 100% without the teleconverter, it's a beautiful image, crystal clear. There's another factor to consider when you're considering whether it's better to crop to 200% or use a teleconverter. And this is a universal consideration, regardless of the quality of your lens, really. And that is two things: focus and exposure. Mostly focus. Let me explain exposure first. If you're using a matrix type of exposure, or a mixed reading exposure, when your camera, and you're shooting loose with the intent to crop, your exposure meter is analyzing a much larger scene than what you intend to eventually crop down to, right? And I hope you're probably shooting with that crop in mind, right? If that's your intent. So you know that I only want the center portion, or I only want the left or right portion of this image when I crop it in. But your meter is taking into consideration the entire field of view that it has available to it. And so the exposure for the subject and the composition you want may not be as accurate as it would be if you simply had that focal length and the meter was only looking at what you intended to compose. So that's one. Number two, your autofocus system is also going to be equally taxed and, quite honestly, overtaxed by trying to focus on an image that is much smaller, all right? At least half as small. And you're trying to focus on that image and on the subject, rather, that is much smaller in the viewfinder, and therefore much smaller to the sensor, much smaller to your autofocus system. So your autofocus system is going to struggle to get sharp on the subject in a lot of cases, depending on what your subject is. So if you magnify that, your autofocus system is much more likely to be able to grab a hold of the intended subject and be tack sharp on it. So the benefit of a teleconverter is, what I'm seeing in front of me is that it's a sharper image, better contrast, less chromatic aberration, and you're going to have a more accurate exposure. You can almost see that here because I had artificial light on this test paper that I shot. And you can see that the one is much brighter than the other because the lens was on the test paper, pretty much filled the frame for the 400 millimeter. And so the exposure was taken off of just that white paper. And you can see the difference in exposure here. So that's a perfect example of what's going to happen with your exposure. So you have an exposure advantage, you have an autofocus advantage, and I think you have overall quality advantage in this case. Now, every lens, every teleconverter, every brand is probably going to be a little bit different, but to answer the question and to kind of follow through with part two on this, for this particular lens, and again, this is the Nikon Z9 was the camera. This was the 70 to 200 f2.8 S Z mount lens with the new Z 2.0 teleconverter. Now, one thought I had after doing that, sitting at the computer comparison, was that that color fringing that we're seeing and that chromatic aberration could also have something to do with the exposure difference. You can see how much whiter one is versus gray because of the exposure difference, and that could also be bringing out a lot more color. So again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not wearing a white lab coat, and I don't claim that this is an antiseptic comparison, but hopefully it gives us all a good idea of just, how this lens compares with and without the teleconverter, and that's really the point. Another viewer had commented about how excited he was with the prospect of the very short minimum focusing distance with this lens and the teleconverter, which could give you 400 millimeters at a pretty close shooting range, which is not a macro lens, but sure could provide some interesting close-ups, even more so when you consider that you can be a good distance from a subject, to where, like, if it's a small, insect or animal or something like that, and not be disturbing it. Or even if it's something that, you don't want to get into blocking the natural light that's on it or whatever, gives you that opportunity to have a good distance and yet be close enough to get meaningful magnification. So I did a couple of shots when I was out in the field with close-up on this, and I didn't try to get, hit the exact minimum distance, which I have measured at approximately 39 inches. Now, they may be published and be a little bit different than that, but I got it focused as sharp as I could, as short as I could, and measured from the sensor, not from the lens, but it's from the sensor on the camera to the subject, was 39 inches. Close, thereabouts. Not only was I impressed with the sharpness and magnification at that distance, obviously I wasn't going for depth of field. I was shooting wide open, so the depth of field falls off really quick. But what I was also impressed with was the detail in the deep shadow and still the detail in the snow in this one shot. So that's pretty impressive range, and that probably has to do more with the camera than it does with the lens and obviously with the teleconverter, which brings me to point number 2, or point number 3, I've lost count. So all of the still images and video in this video that I did on this part 2 test with this lens and teleconverter were done with the Z9. So Nikon's new Z9 flagship camera certainly can be considered best in class, and I think we can say that about this lens, and in my opinion, we can say that about this teleconverter. So we really have, the trifecta here of best, best, and best at work, and I think it produced very good results. So not only are the still images good, and the ones that I'm going to show you in this video have been post-produced, just my normal processing. I cropped them the way I liked them. Nothing extravagant. I didn't crop them deeply, but just, I trimmed them to what I would want, and, applied maybe a tiny bit of sharpening and, white balance and things like that. So anything you see there is not raw out of the camera. So I don't want to mislead anybody about that. The video, though, that I'll show you was all shot, again, here on the Z9 with this lens and this teleconverter, mostly at full magnification, 400 millimeters, all of it wide open at 5.6. It might have been at f8. I take that back. A lot of the video may have been at f8. But handheld, all of it was handheld, and it was done at 4K 120 frames per second, which renders down in 30 frames per second to beautiful slow motion. So that's what I will leave you with, and hopefully this little bit of part 2, a little bit of added information based on a couple of your suggestions and requests was helpful. I definitely have a lot more planned with the Z9, and I've already been doing a lot of work with it. Plan to do a whole lot more, and I will bring you more information about it in the pretty near future. Thanks for watching. If you don't subscribe, I'd love it if you would, and I would definitely love it if you go hit that like button. Thanks, and see you next time.
Mm.